Okay. Greetings, and thank you for joining this presentation by Alfred Willis, PhD, entitled Alfred Panepinto, Modernist. It was originally delivered on Zoom on March 11th, 2021, as the first talk in our Elusive Philadelphia School, The Many Guises of Philadelphia's Modernism series. But due to technical problems, we are re-recording it again today, April 14th. Al Willis, an independent scholar, has degrees in art history, library science, concluding with a PhD in art history and archaeology from Columbia University. He retired from his position at Hampton University in 2013. Presently based in Tennessee, he has consulted on projects around the US and has published on a wide variety of architectural topics. If you are not a member of the Philadelphia chapter of SAH, please consider learning more about us. You can see our link on the first slide here. Go to our website and find out about us and consider joining us. We would love to have new members. While you consider that in the future, I will now introduce Al Willis. Thank you, Al.
Thank you, David. In a time and a place other than 20th century Philadelphia, Alfred Panepinto might have been a court architect, since almost all of his career revolved around J. Howard Pew, Pew's family, their interests, and their charities. Sun Oil Company was the family's chief business, the control of which Pew inherited in 1912. By the 1950s, the Presbyterian and patriotic Pew, installed in his Glenmead estate near Bryn Mawr, had become one of America's most outspoken conservatives. He embraced all of the positions that Brian Doherty identified as constituting post-war American conservatism. And here I link some quotes: a traditionalism, often religious, with strong European and Catholic strains, sometimes rabid anti-communism, and anti-state libertarianism, subsumed under fealty to the Republican Party. Panepinto, the Roman Catholic son of Sicilian immigrants to Philadelphia, in youth was a polymath whose interests spanned from poetry to technology to art. He earned a BS in civil engineering from Villanova in 1928, then went on to Harvard for training in architecture, which he completed in 1931. Harvard's program in the late 20s took the Beaux-Arts approach. It emphasized the sketching of precedents, the analytique, and formal composition. It also, however, stressed building technology, materials, and structures. Panepinto's teachers at Harvard advised their students to approach problems in a modern American way that involved pragmatic integration of form, materials, and function. The students attended to American precedents while remaining abreast of the latest architectural fashions emanating from Europe, especially France. Reliance on the use of bilateral symmetry to achieve balance could be tempered by combining symmetrical elevations with asymmetrical ones in order spatially to express disparate functions in logical sequence, much as Paul Cray had done in his Detroit Institute of Arts of 1922. Frontality and axiality nevertheless remained highly valued, while the emulation of novel approaches to emphasizing them was encouraged. Thus, James Gamble Rogers's giant door at the center of his New York Presbyterian Hospital of 1926 would reappear in a Panepinto design produced at Harvard in 1929. Panepinto's modernistic 1931 thesis design combined four facades into a composition that eschewed bilateral symmetry almost altogether. It retained a few local symmetries in elevation and maintained some axial relationships in plan. After graduating, Panepinto went to work in the office that a slightly older classmate, William Galvin, had set up in Cambridge. He remained in that office until 1934. Galvin's production seems to have followed Harvard's preference for a modernism that was moderate rather than radical, characterized by straightforwardness and relative austerity, but also allegiant to bilateral symmetry. So too did Panepinto's architecture in the 1930s, to judge by an unsuccessful proposal for a new library for Villanova. There, a giant door in a central section that is both taller and more massive than its reciprocated flanking wings conveys a strong sense of order, perhaps even a reactionary striving to reestablish the financial and hence also social orders that the crash of 1929 had disrupted. To capitalists such as Pew, who had prospered under the laissez-faire system, Roosevelt's New Deal of 1932 appeared likely to perpetuate rather than solve that disruption. Ford took a leading position among the anti-New Dealers on the right wing of US politics, who would back Alf Landon for president in 1936, and who would go on to reconfigure the laissez-faire ideology into what came to be called free enterprise and later the libertarian spirit. I believe in our free enterprise system, Pew was quoted in his New York Times obituary. I followed it all my life. I think it made America a great nation. Efforts to destroy it will take us back to the conditions of the Middle Ages. Evidently, Panepinto shared Pew's conservative conception of mid-20th century progress as a process of returning present conditions to past conditions, for he produced not only a flattering portrait of Landon to be used by his campaign, but also at least one editorial cartoon to bolster it. Already in 1934, Pew had hired Panepinto into his Sun Oil organization. The two men appear to have worked closely together on not just Sun Oil, but also many other projects continuously until Pew's death in 1971. Political congruence alone cannot explain why Pew found in Panepinto such an attractive employee. The decisive factor was probably the young man's ability in graphic art. That ability he showcased not only in work for Sun Oil, but also in external commissions, such as this cover for the Saturday Evening Post, which, in concert with the magazine's editorial policies, celebrated plutocracy. The cover subtly engaged the horse race as a metaphor of that American democracy that the New Deal had wrenched away from the country's businessmen and leisure class. Panepinto's initial role at Sun seems to have been that of an internal arbiter of taste who contributed heavily to the company's initiatives in advertising and public relations. In the late 1930s, those initiatives came to embrace architectural design aimed at producing what Jekyll and Scully in their 1994 book on the gas station in America termed place product packaging. Whether Panepinto actually designed any of the clean, efficient Sun stations in which Pew's company embodied its brand is not a question I can yet answer, but surely he exercised some influence over the designs eventually selected, starting with the generation of 1939 and continuing into the 1950s. In that connection, Panepinto deployed a keen sense of architecture as a messaging system, a subject that he had explored explicitly in at least one of his Harvard exercises. Worth noting here is that the exploration and exploitation of architecture's potential to convey messages by both implicit and explicit means had become, by the 1970s, a major obsession of Philadelphia's Denise Scott Brown, Steve Eisenhower, and Robert Venturi. During World War II, Panepinto served the Allies in the European theater, where in 1944, he produced this Christmas greeting in which I believe A self-portrait can be discerned in the Italian figure at lower right. After the war, Panepinto returned to the service of Sun Oil Company and became increasingly involved in its building projects. In the late 1940s, he designed a laboratory for the company's Marcus Hook plant, which may have been the building seen near the entrance here and in the background of another view here on the right. From such partial views, I will not attempt to characterize a building that I've not been able positively to document as a work of Panepinto, or even to see it in person. I will only observe that this structure, which curiously adopts the fins of the Tribune Tower proposal by Gropius and Meyer, does not appear to fall far from the conservatively modern aesthetics favored by Cray in the 1940s. In the foreground of this same view is seen a memorial that at least one source has attributed to Panepinto, rather than to the more likely architect and sculptor. That assignment perhaps means that Panepinto produced the initial concept sketch for it. In any event, neither the pedestal nor the figure evinces any of the progress made in modern sculpture or its presentation since the time of Rodin. Both are decidedly conservative and as such temper the modernistic effect of the more adventurous building that looms behind them. An undated rendering, recently auctioned for a building proposed for an unidentified 1000 block in Philadelphia, may date from as late as 1950. The fragmentary address suggests the possibility of a project for the Jefferson Medical College. The style reflects the long afterlife enjoyed by the Art Deco tendency in certain American taste cultures. A Panepinto building from the mid-50s reveals the equally long shadow cast over American design by the streamline or art moderne tendency of the Depression decade, when it might have just as easily been interpreted as a riposte to New Deal aesthetics as an expression of them. While on the whole, the Schwenksville Library's facade comes across as progressively modern, yet its composition preserves the conservative tendency to emphasize centrality by subtly exaggerating the height of a main entrance bay. From 1958, Panepinto's recreation center for Sun Oil Company employees amounts to an enlarged version of his library for Schwenksville. It too exploits the quarter cylinders that hallmarked our modern architecture in its pre-war heyday. It also evokes centrality by heightening and thus emphasizing, although simultaneously recessing, the entrance bay. Its fenestration appears to have been in part motivated by functional considerations, but in other part by formal ones. Thus, the composition here may be said to evince the complexity and contradiction of which Venturi began taking special note in the 1950s. The quasi-random mixture of ribbon and isolated openings indeed strikingly recalls the same mixture in Venturi's house for his mother in Chestnut Hill. The side elevation, which involves changes in height without corresponding changes in depth, as the principle of interpenetration cherished by mainstream modernism demanded, also recalls a mannerism deployed by Venturi's firm in various designs of the 1960s, including the fire station at Columbus, Indiana. For the Presbyterian-supported Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, of which Pugh was an alumnus and long chairman of the board, Panepinto designed all of the buildings erected during the presidency of John Harker between 1956 and 1971. This series began with the President's House, undertaken in 1957, to a design that could hardly have presented from the outside a more traditional appearance. The first substantial contribution to this series of projects for Grove City came in 1958, a classroom building dubbed Calderwood Hall. In plan, it was strictly rectilinear. Rather than engage in curvature, Its main facade was slightly asymmetrical, even as it emphasized the central importance of its entrance via a giant arched doorway in a mass of exaggerated height. The hence ambiguously traditional yet modern effect evidently appealed to Pew as well as to Panepinto. I conjecture that the example of the likewise ambiguously traditional yet modern library built for Villanova in 1947 enabled, so to speak, Panepinto's approach in this case. As a design, the main front of Calderwood Hall showed fidelity to the late 18th century Baroque principles of composition, only slightly compromised by a 20th century concession to the 19th century enthusiasm for irregular effects, then considered to be more conducive to functionality and later perhaps also to democracy. Emil Kaufmann, in his 1955 analysis of architecture in the Age of Reason, had pointed out the basis of modern architecture in the mid-18th century search for novel post-Baroque arrangements of masses and fenestration. Kaufmann laid special emphasis on how advanced architects of the late 1700s cast aside the principles of gradation, concatenation, and unification, as well as of reciprocation, on which the Baroque system had relied. By rejecting the new compositional approaches of what Kaufmann perceived as emergent modernism, the perpetuation of that Baroque system into the 20th and now the 21st centuries would inevitably manifest to some degree a rejection of the modernist project. In the most sublime of the Philadelphia exemplars of the modern approach, as Kaufmann defined it, the PSFS Tower, the composition does indeed allow variety and juxtaposition to displace both unification and concatenation. Gradation is there undermined by an arbitrary sculpturesque arrangement of the masses. Then it extends even to a willful diagonality at the apex. All of the facades are asymmetrical in and of themselves. Symmetrical and axial relationships are downplayed by confining them to only selected parts of the interior. A less sublime example, drawn from the pages of a 1954 issue of Architectural Forum, shows how the selfsame strategies applied to a brief very similar to that of Calderwood Hall resulted in a structure conveying no sense of centrality whatsoever. In several projects of the early 1960s, Panepinto further displayed his ability to subordinate modern to traditional taste. Into a parish complex at Schwenksville, he introduced only a slight hint of art moderne styling in the form of a porch appended to a structure that otherwise was so traditional as to pass for vernacular. In Swarthmore, Panepinto appended a more daring expression of modern taste, a Guises-styled narthex, onto a church hall of the simplest, most traditional rectangular and gabled shape. Along the side of the church, he designed fenestration that presented itself as ambiguously inserted windows, suggestive of traditional construction, and gaps in the wall plane, characteristic of a modern approach. In the adjacent school, he contained the modern curtain wall within a rigid brick frame, thus, as it were, limiting the possibility of a modern structure's escape into a wider environment that modernism could not have been allowed to contaminate. For a difficult site in Chester, which required placing an entrance at a corner, Panepinto created an alumni auditorium to serve the Pennsylvania Military College. The design evolved through several iterations, all of which engaged to some extent the old-fashioned aesthetic of art moderne. The arrangement and furnishing of the interior appear to have been, by and large, unadventurous, with minor exceptions. A suggestion of ribbon windows on one of the exterior walls echoes the horizontal treatment of the theater's side walls inside. For the same college, Panepinto produced a science and engineering building that was much more frankly modern in its massing and external treatment. Like the alumni auditorium, the completed version featured false ribbon windows in place of the genuine ones the architect had originally proposed. It is hard to know whether the change was due to the client's preference or budgetary constraints or both. Comparing the published rendering with the built structure suggests that the design may have been reversed in development. Clearly not due to budget constraints was the creation of a dramatic hypaethral entrance portico in the reentrant corner, so as to create a processional approach to the building's interior. Nearby, in 1963, Panepinto designed an office building for the local school district. Its curtain walling between expanses of brick suggests what the architect had originally intended for the PMC's science and engineering building. The district building is divided into two unequal parts separated by a transparent lobby. In 1964, a 1958 graduate of the architecture program at the University of Pennsylvania, Hagop Kitabjian, joined Panepinto's staff. During his years at Penn, Kitabjian would have been exposed to the ideas of Louis Kahn, Venturi, and other formative figures of the Philadelphia School. Kitabjian's education may already have manifested itself in the 1964 student union that Panepinto's firm produced for Pennsylvania Military College. It is a brutalist structure that more frankly expresses its structural system than any of Panepinto's own designs seem to have done before. Kitabjian may have had less influence over the design of an engineering building for Grove City College in the next year, since there, Pugh's personal connection to both the college and Panepinto would likely have required a preponderance of the design responsibility being reserved to the latter. In this building, modernism has been almost totally suppressed. Its reference are the most traditional motifs found in earlier compositions by, or probably known to Panepinto. In 1960, Jerome Holland, who had been an African-American protege of Pugh at Sun Oil, became principal of Hampton Institute in Virginia. In that role, he inherited a major campus expansion that had begun in 1959. Possibly on Pugh's recommendation, Holland soon replaced the architect who had formerly been in charge of it, Hilliard Robinson, with his erstwhile colleague at Sun, Panepinto. Thus, to complete the 1959 building program, Panepinto added 2 dormitories to the Hampton campus in 1962-63. The 2 red brick buildings are similar, but not identical. Each sets off a lower, smaller mass against a higher, larger one. In 1966, Holland initiated a second campus expansion program dubbed the Centennial Campus Plan to coincide with the centennial of Hampton's founding in 1868. As work at Hampton proceeded, Panepinto's firm completed 3 buildings for the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Sciences, beginning with the Student Union, White Car Hall, of 1965. The design of White Car Hall owes much to that of the Student Union recently completed in Chester, although its brutalism is more mannered. The structural columns now rise between bays rather than between windows, which leaves the windows to be separated by mullions made decoratively to run the entire height of the facade. The entrance is shifted to one extremity of the facade, in which position it denies, in the characteristically modern fashion, any possibility of axial approach. Hampton's Centennial Campus Plan called for 4 classroom buildings, which Panepinto arranged in L-shaped pairs linked by domed cylindrical hyphens. He then arranged these pairs at diagonally opposite corners of a mall, at the center of which he placed an immense fountain. The domes of the hyphens are lamella structures. Panepinto attached a foyer to each hyphen, thus affording each building pair an approach from outside. To those axes, however, no external termini nor strong internal ones was provided. To the end walls of 2 of his Hampton classroom buildings, Panepinto attached almost freestanding screen walls into which he introduced a classical arch. The Centennial Plan also called for a gymnasium, the peculiar design of whose frontispiece recalls no contemporary work so strongly as it does the notorious building board competitively proposed by the Venturi firm for the National Football Hall of Fame. The similarity suggests to me that Khatabjian was bringing into his workplace awareness of vanguard developments as they arose elsewhere in Philadelphia's design community. At the western wall created by Panepinto's master plan for Hampton occurred a large but low cylindrical and domed structure to serve the Institute's program in early childhood education. Its positioning forced the entire mall to be seen as a riff on Thomas Jefferson's plan for the University of Virginia. The suspicion of similarity persists, even though in the Jefferson plan, the focal rotunda was logically taller than the structures it commanded, whereas at Hampton, the corresponding structure was much less prominent. Moreover, as originally conceived, the axis that the circular building at Hampton terminated, Panepinto subordinated to the diagonal axis running between the reentrant corners of his 2 pairs of paired classroom buildings. That diagonal emphasized the centrality of his fountain, even as it denied its placement on the relatively minor axis terminating in the early childhood educational facility. There is, by the way, no evidence that Panepinto ever intended to add any additional buildings to his therefore highly mannered mall design, though structures added to it by other architects have destroyed its original effect. Only one of the two mid-rise dorms that Panepinto proposed ever got built at Hampton. Only the smaller part of a hyphenated student union located to the west of the early childhood education facility was completed. Its derivation from earlier union designs by the Panepinto office is obvious. Near Charlottesville, Virginia, Panepinto completed a country house in 1967, and it has been somewhat changed. Modern by virtue of its straightforward use of materials and estual of ornament, it is all but Palladian, hence anti-modern, in its symmetry. Its angled wings bring to mind those of Stupinigi. Absurdly, though perhaps not impertinently, since the castle's parterres had already found a correspondent in the shape of Panepinto's grand fountain on the Hampton Institute Mall. Meanwhile, back in Grove City, the architect created a structure that even more clearly found its inspiration in seeing Baroque architecture through the lens of modernism. Hicks Hall comprised a U-shaped 3-story dormitory and a 1-story dining facility. The latter occupied the position that a forecourt would have held in a 17th or 18th century palace. Reinforcing its reading as a forecourt was the provision of an entrance portico along the symmetrical south or main front of the entire complex. A modernist treatment of the fenestration as continuous breaks in wall planes rather than as an arrangement of discrete openings, together with the asymmetry of its side elevations, tempered the dominant traditionalism of Hicks Hall. Beginning about 1968, Panepinto produced several quasi-modern buildings for the Waxhaw, North Carolina headquarters of the Jungle Aviation and Radio Service. The commission likely came to him indirectly through Pugh, since both Pugh and Henderson Belk were close to Billy Graham and shared a devotion to free enterprise and other right-wing causes of the post-war decades. Belk provided substantial funding to the Waxhaw organization, which is rooted even in evangelicalism and has been linked to the CIA. Panepinto's later work for Hampton included a natural sciences building whose modularity and mass may be distantly related to those aspects of Richard's medical research labs. The wall treatment, however, reproduces that of the Student Union in Chester. The decorative treatment used to emphasize the main entrance derives, despite its off-center positioning, from a similar above the main entrance to the engineering building at Grove City College. Also in 1968, Panepinto designed a linking his White Car Hall and the new McNeil building at the Pennsylvania College of Pharmacy and Sciences, with the latter nearly mirroring and hence reciprocating the former. Either side of a frankly historicizing, the ensemble became an ironically Baroque composition made up of stylistically modern buildings. In that way, the somewhat, but by no means strictly symmetrical ensemble may be said to evince a conservative modernism. On the Chester campus of what became known in the late 60s as the PMC colleges, Panepinto's firm completed a third experiment that appears in retrospect to be a conservative or indeed postmodern rethinking of modernist design. The brief called for buildings, which at Hampton, were arranged into an irregular L shape. In Chester, however, there were 3 masses of various sizes rather than 2 of equal size to dispose. Internally, 2 of the 3 the architects planned in full accordance with functionalism, but the third they symmetrically subdivided into 2 identical auditoriums flanking a lobby. Externally, the symmetrical mass was made shorter than the other 2. Described as ultra-modern in an announcement upon its completion, this Kapelski Center hardly fit that adjective's definition. In fact, it was eclectic, and it was stylistically retrograde. Its interior lobby of stripped character, interior featured not only a classicizing porch and an Italian loggia, but also one of the screen arched appendages with which Panepinto had earlier endowed Hampton. Hence, his design of the Kapelski Center was furthermore derivative. The curvature of the matching screens at Hampton and Chester recall that of Fontana's San Marcello in Rome, and so references unmistakably the Baroque architecture that in its own time had been a kind of conservative modernism, simultaneously progressive in form, but reactionary in content. Their thinness recalls the interest among other architects evinced in the 60s in screening. Set like traditional statuary against a modern background, the arches set up a dynamic of messaging that remains hard to decipher. Nevertheless, that the obscure irony inherent for the purposes of propaganda can be doubted. Their closest parallel may be the colonnade set up in 1964, the Hall of Free Enterprise, a New York World's Fair pavilion funded in part by Pew. Involving that structure and more serious and con, as well as some of the message-laden constructions in which Venturi and Scott Brown found inspiration. Many postmodern architects, their justification would be worth untangling. In addition to the library at Hampton Institute, Panepinto, together perhaps with Katobjian, produced a piece of fully fledged postmodernism that bears comparison with Guildhall. The facade is central and symmetrical. Those are treated in the pre-modern manner as discrete openings in a plane rather than as spatial discontinuities of a plane. The surface is handled in painterly fashion that might fairly be regarded as evidence of Panepinto's special skill as a graphic artist. Entire composition is self-consciously flat, abstract, and decorative. Its central motif revives an earlier motif repeatedly affected by Panepinto, thus evincing conservatism by refusing originality. The uppermost windows overlap the entablature, thus denying the latter's tectonic purpose while highlighting its purely compositional role as a line. Windows similarly cut across by moldings or string courses in Venturi's seminal work, while in the library's annex, while in the library's annex, a fenestrated surface riffs on that of Guildhouse in particular and recalls that building's own debt to the vernacular architecture of Rome, as well as to the Roman predilection for centrality. Panepinto's infirmary for Grove City College seems to have been his last foray into a conservative modernism incorporating obvious historical references. As he aged, Panepinto may have allowed Katobjian to take on greater responsibility for the firm's design work. Thus, their YMCA in Chester exhibits a modernism uncompromised except by the formality of its entrance pavilion, which is yet tempered by allowing a cantilever to obviate the possibility of a recognizably Palladian porch. In 1972, Panepinto had a commission to design numerous buildings for Westminster Theological Seminary near Chestnut Hill, but I cannot identify any particular one as one of his designs. I do not know whether Panepinto's project for cylindrical St. Luke's Tower was ever carried out, or what part he himself played in its design, which appears to follow that of a type of Holiday Inn. A pair of brutalist doors completed for Widener University in the mid-1970s suggests not only Venturi's fascination with duality, but even more so the kind of work in brick one might expect of a con student of the 1950s, when Katobjian was studying architecture at Penn. I therefore believe that this ensemble should be ascribed mainly to him. Two even later works, however, I assign to Panepinto working more or less alone. From 1984, there is St. Mary the Virgin Church at Shrinksville. Panepinto's home parish. Its facade is strictly symmetrical, like that of the Architect's Church at Swarthmore. Though but minimally ornamented, the Shrinksville Church exploits contrasting vertical and horizontal striations with areas of unbroken color. Like the Sun Center field, its profile is convex. Remarkably, though, its facade curves not in one dimension, but two. This church's design therefore participates quite clearly in perpetuating Baroque ideas, even as it recalls the taste for convexity evinced not only in earlier work by Panepinto himself, but also in some of his first employer, Galvin. The church's interior exposes its roof structure of laminated wood, whose use recalls the advice of his teachers at Harvard in the 1920s to exploit the most modern materials available to their fullest potential. Panepinto's last work demonstrates how far his skills as an architect could range into environmental art. His Columbus Memorial in Norristown occupies a conceptual space within what Rosalind Krauss termed three-dimensional art's expanded field, in which, over the course of the post-war decades, the traditional lines between sculpture, building, and landscape became blurred. Formally, this memorial develops a number of the motifs Panepinto had showcased decades earlier in Hampton and elsewhere, including the circle, water as both shimmering surface and translucent spray, the hemisphere, the lamella, and freestanding statuary. Although Alfred Panepinto's name has seldom appeared in the literature of architectural history, he did produce a body of mid-20th century work that raises hard questions about why an apparently progressive cultural expression, modernism, could prove useful to the furtherance of conservative ideals. Examining that work itself helps to improve understanding of the broader context in which the Philadelphia School emerged and operated on both formal and ideological levels. Further exploring the history of its production may lead to an improved understanding of how postmodernism emerged on America's post-war architectural scene, which was nothing if not a difficult whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. That was a fascinating presentation looking at the complex relationship between traditional and modern ways of creating architecture, looking at architects and clients' political points of view and worldviews. It's really an amazing insight into this part of our history. Because we do not have an audience with us presently, I will do my best to retrieve as much as possible of the Q&A session from the first time you presented this talk, so that anyone who accesses this file online will be able to witness the questions and your responses to them.
Thank you.
And with that, I thank you for being able to do this twice. And that way make it available to people through our website. So best wishes to you, and I'm going to stop the recording, and then you and I can have a little post presentation discussion. But thank you all for watching, and thank you, Al, for the presentation.